So, einen schönen guten Abend und herzlich willkommen zu unserem Transatlantic Tuesday. This is the last German sentence I'll speak. Please leave your microphones muted to ensure the best sound quality possible. But if you like, you can leave your cameras on and show your face. We're happy to see some of our
The
audience.
sound quality is very...
Is it not good, the sound quality? I'll turn my microphone up. Yeah, my name is Friederike Schulte and I'm the director of the Carl-Schurz-Haus, the German-American Institute here in Freiburg, and I'm happy to welcome you to our cooperation with the Centre Culturel Français in Freiburg. Tonight, the title in German is Querdenker und anti-vaxxer, Ungeimpft in Deutschland, Frankreich und den USA. If you want me to translate Querdenker, I'm a little hesitant to do so, but it would be lateral thinkers, maybe. And if that term is actually, I don't know what you think about that term, but lateral thinkers and anti-vaxxer, unvaccinated in Germany, France, and the US. And we've invited 3 experts, of which we would like to welcome 2. And unfortunately, Professor François Salvadori cannot make it tonight. But Florence Dancoisne, the director of the Freiburg Centre Culturel Français, who's been a kind of a COVID director. She started in January 2020, so just done online events together, I think, so far. She has talked to Professor Salvadori at length, and she will represent the French perspective tonight and help me moderate quite a bit. So thank you, Florence, for that. And for this cooperation on a very permanent current issue that deserves an international dialogue. And thank you all for being open to an English speaking event to make sure that we find, that's very funny that the Americans, yeah, right, exactly. We're thankful from the American perspective. So before we start with the brief introductions of our speakers, let me say a few words just about technicalities and our itinerary tonight. This event will be recorded, and if our speakers agree, we will put it on our YouTube channel tomorrow. You can just Google that, Carl-Schurz-Haus YouTube Transatlantic Tuesday. We're planning on discussing for a little less than an hour until around 8 o'clock, maybe a little after. And we'd like to establish an international dialogue on where we stand in France, Germany, and the US concerning our vaccination status and why we are where we are, and how our governments have handled the pandemic. Is there maybe something we can learn from one another? What obstacles are we facing in the 3 countries to reach herd immunity that stem maybe from social factors? So how strong are the anti-vaccination convictions in each country? Who does not want to get vaccinated, and what cultural backgrounds can maybe explain this hesitancy or even militarization against the COVID-19 vaccination? I wanted to mention as well that this is not a discussion that is just medically based or medically focused. This is more comparative cultural analysis with people with a sociology and political science background. And if you'd like to ask questions, you can post them in the chat relating to our discussion with this focus of an international, intercultural comparison. Our Bundesfreiwillige Josefine is on board tonight, and she will moderate the chat. And at the end of the discussion, which should not really run longer than 90 minutes total, so we want to close at around 8:30, we'll choose a couple of questions from the chat. So I'd like to start and welcome our American panelists. Welcome Professor Brendan Nyhan. He teaches at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, which is one of the top liberal arts colleges in the US. He's at the Department of Government. His expertise in health and public policy, especially misinformation and truth in politics and healthcare. He's published various articles related to COVID-19 and has studied the various strategies in the vaccination efforts. And there's also an Atlantic article, which I hope we will refer to tonight, which is already a piece of ancient history because it was December 2020, before everyone get vaccinated. It was voicing all the hopes on how vaccination could go well. So it's a nice referral point for us tonight. Professor Nyhan has also a very vibrant Twitter account, which is worth following. So welcome, Professor Nyhan, to you in snowy New Hampshire. And I'd like to hand over to Florence to introduce our other guests.
Hello, welcome from my side. Thank you so much, Friederike, for initiating this cooperation for this discussion. I am speaking for myself tonight as co-moderator for the Centre Culturel Français, and as Friederike said right up front, I was able to speak to Professor Salvadori on the phone, who is not able to join us tonight and very much regrets it. She will probably be following the discussion in the YouTube cover later on. I am pleased to introduce first Professor Edgar Grande. Professor Edgar Grande was formerly the chairholder of the comparative political science at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. And he has moved in 2017 to Berlin as the founding director of the Zentrum für Zivilgesellschaftsforschung, the Center for Civil Society Research at the Berlin Science Center for Social Research. His special fields of study are civil society, political conflicts, and social movements. And we have noted him as the author of a famous study on Covidioten, which I'm not going to translate, which was published in 2020. So welcome and thank you for joining us, Professor Grande. And so next I am introducing, even though she's not there, Professor Françoise Salvadori from the Université de Bourgogne. She is a biologist from schooling. She also has a doctoral degree in pharmacology. She's an associate professor of immunology at the Université de Bourgogne. She has been working as a biologist and a pharmacologist in the first part of her career, and in recent years, about 10 years, she has been more and more working on the history of science and has taken special interest on opponents to vaccine and vaccine doubts. This is why we had invited her tonight, of course. So since I had the privilege of speaking to her, maybe I would like to start with the first question with an input from her. So we titled this discussion anti-vax movement, but the first thing we spoke about, Françoise and I on the phone, was in France you can hardly speak of one movement. You have many little movements, many groups of people with many motivations. She insisted also that it's important to distinguish between people who are not vaccinated but maybe just skeptical, or at any rate not absolutely against it, and people who are openly anti-vaccine and militantly so. So I was wondering, or I would like to throw the ball to ask if it's the same thing, if you can also speak maybe first to Professor Nyhan of a multitude of vaccine opponents, or if there is a certain logic, or not logic, but homogeneity to them.
Sure, and thank you to the organizers for having me. No, I very much agree with the points you were just making. I think they apply in the United States as well. People tend to think of the most visible aspects of the anti-vaccine movement those activists, speakers, and groups that are dogmatically against vaccines, and to attribute support for them to anyone who is hesitant about vaccines. But I think that's a mistake. As you suggested, there are many disparate kinds of groups that have hesitations about vaccines, often for very different reasons. So here in the United States, in the pre-COVID period, there were sometimes areas that had low vaccination uptake that leaned to the left. For instance, in the affluent area north of San Francisco, there were places that leaned to the right that had relatively low vaccine uptake, like Idaho, a kind of rural, heavily white state here in the US. There were religious and ethnic groups that had various forms of distrust for established medical authorities where we saw outbreaks. The Amish, there was an outbreak of measles among the Amish in Ohio. There was an outbreak among the Somali American community outside Minneapolis, Minnesota. There's an outbreak in the Orthodox community in New York City. So there were all these different kinds of vaccine hesitancy out there. They had never coalesced into a single movement. And in fact, the damage that they had done here in the US was in some ways less than, for instance, in the UK, where there was a significant downturn in their vaccination rates after the famous article that falsely claimed that vaccines cause autism, which people probably have heard of. The damage here was much less, but there had been a move to start to relax the school entry requirements for vaccines. And that so the movement to some extent coalesced around that in the early 2000s. Pre-COVID, though, the momentum was in the other direction. States were starting to tighten their laws, making it more difficult to obtain an exemption in order to bring their vaccination rates up among children entering kindergarten. And this was, I think, largely successful. The trend was positive. And then COVID happens, right? And so what I would say as a starting point for our conversation is that the fear here is that COVID will help vaccine hesitancy become attached to especially party membership and identity in a way it hasn't before. So here in the United States, there had been left and right elements that were uncomfortable with vaccines, but the leadership of both parties was strongly in favor of vaccination. And that kept it as a consensus issue that was not part of the scope of partisan conflict. Now we're seeing the issue becoming more linked to Republican Party elites. And we're seeing ambitious politicians at the state level start to promote not just efforts to undermine COVID vaccine mandates, but we're starting to see state legislators trying to make moves against school entry requirements for other vaccines. So that's very dangerous. I'd say the two-part danger that I'm very worried about here in the United States is first, that this issue becomes partisan, because as you've observed the United States, when issues become partisan, it's very hard for us. We have a very difficult time. Party identity is a very powerful force in our politics. And second, that the politicization we've seen on vaccines extends to, with the politicization we've seen on COVID vaccines extends to other vaccines as well. That hasn't happened yet. Now, neither of these things has happened yet. So the last thing I'll say, both of the following are true here in the United States. The first is that most Republicans are vaccinated. The second thing is most of the unvaccinated are Republicans. And we have to be able to hold both of those ideas in our heads at the same time. It is actually true that most Republicans are getting vaccinated, but not enough. And the most visible and vocal folks speaking against vaccination right now are on the political right. If that becomes a partisan issue, we're in very big trouble, given that we have a 50-50 country and you can't maintain herd immunity with just half the country getting vaccinated.
Right. Professor Grande, in your study in 2020, you had words to describe the unvaccinated. Professor Nyhan, you just started sketching the variety, the diversity of the unvaccinated. We had actually thought that it would be very nice to hear about that study. I think, Friederike, you have it at hand, and then maybe Professor Grande can react to it.
I put it through a translation machine and then went over it. It's a quote from the Frankfurter Allgemeine Sonntagszeitung that you used in your study as well, about the Querdenker demonstration in Berlin on August 29 in 2020. And I think around 37,000 people took part in that. So it was pretty huge. And I was describing the scene there. They were people you would meet at a gas station, at the lake on the weekends, in a pizzeria, at Dad's 75th birthday, cheerful men in plaid shirts, gray-haired ladies with smart glasses, girls in cropped shirts and shorts, muscular boys, grandpas with beards, Rasta women. They had signs and flags with them, most of which were harmless, confessions of Jesus, peace, and courage.
Yeah, this is how they looked like. If you look at if you look at the pictures taken from the big mass demonstrations in August and in August 2020, this is exactly what they show. It's very heterogeneous, and the big question is what brought these different kinds of people together. What's the motivating, what's the unifying force that brings such a diverse crowd together? It's normally you find them if one of the big rock bands and stars performs. But this is definitely not here. This is definitely not the case. So in fact, you can have three different answers to your question. How many movements do we have? Is this really? Is it real? Does it really make sense to speak of one single movement? If we take the definitions from social movement research, who defines social movements as a set of organizations, as a more or less integrated, coherent set of organizations, the first answer would be no, this is not a social movement in a strict sense, because we can't see organizational background. Its organizing basis is very weak. It's not very well integrated, and this is one of the characteristics of the most visible movement, the so-called Querdenker. You translated it to the lateral thinkers. I don't think that this makes a lot of sense. I think most can think of them as Querdenker. This is the established label. And if you look at the development of Corona protest in Germany, you can observe that the Querdenker have become the dominant force on the streets since summer 2000. It's not the only movement organizing opposition against Corona policies and Corona measures. There is a broad variety of different highly specific groups of people: restaurant owners, hotel owners, parents whose children can't go to schools any longer, or to childcare facilities, people working in the cultural, the entertainment business, theaters, concerts, and so on, who more or less are unable to do their job. So there are many good reasons to be highly critical against these measures. And in the first period of Corona protest in Germany in spring 2020, which went along with the first lockdown, it was this diverse resistance against public measures. The Querdenker were not, neither had the lead nor were they the dominant organizing force in this protest. So at this point, there was definitely, if at all, many social movements. And since summer 2000, the Querdenker became the dominant force on the street and in the internet, and they were able to mobilize 10,000s of citizens in the big mass demonstrations in Berlin, Leipzig, Stuttgart, and some other cities. But it's at the moment the protest has been changing its face again with new forms of protest, the so-called Spaziergänge, which take place in smaller and mid-sized cities, and protests has spread all over the country. It's no longer in the big cities, Stuttgart, Berlin, Leipzig, Hamburg, or Munich. You find it almost everywhere. And it's difficult to imagine that there is somebody who's able to coordinate, to steer, to integrate, to guide this protest. What is important is, in contrast to other countries, in Germany, this protest neither has a solid integrated organizational basis, nor has it a face, whether there is an individual spearheading this kind of protest. So if you ask for a face, whom you want, for a representative, whom you want to invite for a talk in a TV station, you would have a lot of difficulties. So just as a thought experiment, think of somebody who might be able to represent me. If you're looking for a Querdenker, for a prominent Querdenker who could represent me in this discussion. This is not. I don't pretend that it's not possible to replace me. That's certainly possible. But my point is, there is no such a face as you had it with Fridays for Future. It's very easy to think of a few prominent representatives of Fridays for Futures, in the both globally and nationally. Querdenken, or the Corona protest more generally, is not characterized by an integrated organization and a spearheading individual. So the question to your answers, how many movements do we have, very much depends on your perspective. It's either it's many, it's a multitude, or it's probably one, but a very specific one, and it's none. It very much depends, and this certainly has consequences when it comes to the political relevance and the future political developments. What is also important in comparison to the US is that it doesn't have that clear-cut partisan roots. It's not rooted in a specific political party. There is no single political party mobilizing this potential, and all the efforts to relate the protest or resistance against vaccination to a party came to nothing. The best example was Saxony, where people tried to relate the high levels of support for the AfD in elections to low vaccination rates. Meanwhile, at first sight, this seemed to be plausible in winter, but meanwhile, it doesn't make too much sense any longer, because the federal states in which show the lowest vaccination rates, meanwhile, have at the same time the lowest infection rates. It's kind of a paradox, and we had very high vaccination rates in the north of Germany, in social democratically governed federal states, which now show the highest infection rates in Germany. So it's kind of a paradox, the consequences, but at the same time, when it comes to political affiliations, most apparently in Bavaria, where you have very low rates in the southern parts of Bavaria, and much higher rates in northern parts. Thus far in Germany, the issue has not been politicized along partisan lines. It's not a matter of partisan polarization. There is not a single party which owns the issue, as, for example, the AfD in the case of migration in 2016 and 2017. But for this, there are good reasons why the corona issue was not able, didn't have the mobilizing force to bring a new party in the national parliament in the last election, although there were several parties who tried to exploit the opportunity, die Basis, die Freien Wähler, and so on. Excuse me.
Thank you so much. So, although it might seem different at the start, we're all standing at very similar places. I wanted to throw in that we do see also the same type of variations in France over the population. For instance, women are more likely to be vaccinated than men because they are overrepresented in the care sector. They work more often in establishments where public has to be tendered to. They are also overrepresented in nursing homes, where the vaccination rate is skyrocketing. So more women are vaccinated. Likewise, more women are officially skeptical or even against vaccines. That's an interesting paradox. If you take the entire population of the entire, not eligible, but complete population, 79.8% of the entire French population have completely, have received at least one shot, and 77.8% have both shots or are considered to be fully covered. This is pretty high actually for a nation that was at first very skeptical and very hesitant in encouraging the population to be vaccinated. Children under 12 are hardly vaccinated. That they had a very, very slow start with them. Likewise, actually, a number of people over in the earlier segment are not vaccinated because they are unable to get to a vaccine. If they're not a nursing home resident, it's likely to be the case. They're unable to get there. They haven't been reached by the different communication campaigns. And sometimes they don't really care because they don't go out anyway. So it's not something that they're very much interested in, but they're at very high risk. There is a strong shift when you go from west to east and from north to south in France, with very high rates in Bretagne, in Normandy, with over 84% of the total population that is vaccinated. And it goes down to 72% if you reach the Mediterranean or in Corse. There is also a very strong difference between rich and poor, so to speak. In the richest city of France, Neuilly, near Paris, you have, I think 92%, you have a very, very high rate of vaccination. And if you go to Marseille, one of the third arrondissement in Marseille, one of the poorest places in France, there's a 50-point difference almost between both of them. And yet, it's not possible to exactly make this situation correspond to political situation or sympathy with the Gilets jaunes. There are intersections because the people that are skeptical or openly defiant of vaccine have very different reasons. So yeah, but maybe before we go more into if you want to ask, I would also ask, because not everybody is on the same page possibly, about the mandate situation in all three countries. In France, until very recently, if you wanted to have access to a restaurant, a cinema, a stadium, you had to show proof of you being vaccinated or recovered or tested. Just very recently, a new law has been voted, and it has come into effect yesterday, and it restricts access to these things to only people who are fully vaccinated or recently recovered. That's much less restrictive than what I have been used to living in Germany. And it's not a vaccine mandate, but it's really close to it. At the same time, and this has to be put together, the government has announced that it is going to start lifting restrictions as of February 3rd, in particular restrictions on the number of people who can attend indoor events, and also the end of mask mandates outside, and also end of the mandatory office, home office arrangement 3 days a week. So I was wondering, I think in the US, it's hard for us to fathom how things actually stand, because I think they're very, very different.
Yes, that's right. So there has been an ongoing set of legal battles. President Biden proposed employer mandate that you would have to have a vaccination or testing if you had 100 or more employees, and also proposed a vaccination mandate for federal workers. The employer mandate was struck down by the Supreme Court in a recent decision, and a district court has blocked the federal worker mandate as well. So it does not appear at this stage that broad federal mandates will be part of the US response for adults. Here in the US, most vaccination has been accomplished through the school entry requirements. But of course, those weren't deployed during a raging pandemic, right? So of course, over time that will, if the COVID vaccines are added to the pediatric vaccine schedule, then in the future will ensure very high vaccination rates, but it'll take many, many years for the population to turn over going through that process. In the meantime, what can be done is going to be left up to individual organizations imposing their own mandates, for instance, hospitals and healthcare systems. In some case, the good news from the United States is, despite all the controversy that I'm sure you see in media coverage over vaccines, when mandates are imposed by employers, almost everyone gets vaccinated. Ultimately, very, very few people choose to leave their jobs when those mandates have been put in place. Time and time again, we've seen a lot of discussion of how many people are going to quit and how it's going to make the workforce shortages we're facing here in the US even more severe. And then it turns out that only a tiny handful of people actually quit. And that raises some concerns actually about the media coverage of this issue. I'd say one thing in general that we should worry about, and I'd be curious how it plays elsewhere, but there's disproportionate focus on those most vocal and visible opponents of vaccines. Obviously, they are important in part because of the threat to herd immunity that they pose. But in the process, people may misunderstand how many people are actually not getting vaccinated. Because, most American adults are vaccinated. Most French and German adults are vaccinated, right? The media coverage, though, every day isn't saying, actually, as of now, 80% of French adults are vaccinated, right? They're showing conflict and people disagree. And again, that's what the news is interested in, of course. But I do worry that it may make people misunderstand the social consensus around vaccination. It has frayed, right? This pandemic has put it under pressure. But I think it nonetheless remains. And actually, it's important to remind people of that, to actually say how strong this consensus is. Most of your friends and neighbors and community members are getting vaccinated, right? That's, of course, less true in some parts of each of our countries than in others, but in general, that is true. And we know social consensus is a powerful influence on human behavior. So that's something that we can and should be reminding people of more often when we can.
Yeah, I think we've already, or Professor Grande already mentioned that the movement in Germany doesn't really have a face. No one's really spearheading it. You're just looking into a very diverse group, and you echoed that from both other countries as well. But I'm quoting from the documentary that Professor Salvadori was involved with that showed in Arte, which greatly featured, I think, Andrew Wakefield in the US as someone who was already on the scene when it was about measles and autism. How do you, I mean, the US, as you say, with a capitalist system, it works best if the employer imposes rules, where we are always waiting for the government to impose a rule and are very, very hesitant to decide. Here in this Open Cultural Institute as well, are we letting people in? How many people are we letting in? What are they supposed to do? We're waiting for instructions, and it's very hard to be in limbo for us. Another interesting sub-question is the federalism in our countries as well. I'm from up north, Lower Saxony, and when I visited my parents, I had the wrong mask with me. I wasn't allowed to go places that I was allowed to go here when I wasn't boosted. And these make these enhance intercultural misunderstandings as well. And I think countries can grow apart when things are so different. One of our teachers here who visited his parents in a senior resort in Florida, the Villages, just told me there's no COVID there. People do just whatever they want. They're meeting, they're having dinner. There's no restriction on numbers. Things like that. So that's my little footnote on federalism and how different it is between our countries. But I wanted to ask about, do you see financial interest? Do you see an economic interest, someone who's taking advantage in the US of the situation? What do you think of Andrew Wakefield as a character in the whole scenario?
Yeah, Andrew Wakefield, unfortunately, is a kind of prototype of how people can become high-profile figures and make money for years and years on this kind of anti-vaccine lecture circuit. We're starting to see other people entering into that space. There's a doctor the New York Times recently profiled by the name of Malone, who actually has some pre-existing scientific credibility, but is now making himself famous by questioning the safety and efficacy of the mRNA vaccines. So sometimes you get these people who have credentials, and Wakefield too, right? They have some credential in some area, and they parlay that into a seemingly credible attack on vaccines, right? Audiences that aren't familiar with the scientific evidence may be persuaded. They say, this is a person who's an expert, and they're telling me that this vaccine is wrong. So I do worry about those people, as well as those people. I was talking about how the potential alignment with the right wing in the United States is a problem. That's an area where there are a lot of kind of political entrepreneurs, if you can think of that term, people who are ambitious and trying to make a name for themselves, who are trying to ride the backlash against vaccine mandates, for instance, to prominence, right, in their political movement, and also to raise money for their political groups, speaker fees, et cetera, to get views for their YouTube channels, all of those things, right? And in the process, they may be drawn to vaccine misinformation. So there's a fairly prominent figure here named Dan Bongino, who's frequently on Fox News and has a widely listened to syndicated radio program, who was just kicked off of YouTube for promoting vaccine misinformation. And this week announced he was actually leaving the platform because he was being censored. So that's an example of someone that's a rising star in the conservative media ecosystem, who started out as a kind of pro-Trump figure in the pre-COVID era and is now bringing that vaccine misinformation and mandate skepticism and so forth into his repertoire of things he uses to generate grievances among his audience. So that kind of and there is an audience for this stuff. You can become quite famous and wealthy if you're able to successfully catalyze it. So those and I'll just add one last thing, just to build on the point I just made, that the social media space makes it easier for people to rise up in that way, right? To attract large audiences, to reach people with fewer intermediaries. Obviously, that has many good features. It's allowed many more kinds of voices to be heard. But in cases like this, it allows for a lot of bottom-up misinformation and for people who are trying to make a name for themselves with false claims to gain a high degree of prominence.
So you see people just using the movement, not creating the movement, basically. Yeah.
But it's dynamic, right? Sometimes it's people are using it, but also in some cases, right, it's coming to new audiences, right? As Bongino's audience hears them talking about the vaccines, or on Fox News, Tucker Carlson's audience hears him questioning the safety and efficacy of COVID vaccines. Or there's a famous podcaster here named Joe Rogan, who has 10 or more million listeners per episode, who had that crank doctor on his show and exposed a huge number of people to his false claims about the safety of the vaccine, right? So in some cases, you're just preaching to the choir, but in other cases, it's actually being brought to these new audiences, right? The profit motive is in part still driving it, right? People trying to be controversial and interesting and so forth. But, the collateral damage to public health is potentially significant.
Mm-hmm. Florence, I'm going to add on another question to Professor Grande and his study, Alles Covidioten, that you can find online as well. It's very interesting and well written. And I think there's a great analysis saying that the majority of the anti-vaccination, the majority of the people who are part of the anti-vaccination movement are from the middle of society, without without party affiliation, or with estranged from politics. And I find that such an interesting way of formulating it. They're in the middle of society, but it sounds like they're not participating in the political process. And that's something that's widely discussed in the US right now, partly in France as well, how our democracy is actually still sustained by the population. Wanted to throw that out to you.
I think this is an important aspect because from the very beginning we are the dominant interpretation of Corona protest was that it's a small that it's an insignificant minority which is by and large radical, represents the extreme oppositions of the ideological spectrum. And both assumptions at closer inspection, surveys show that our surveys, for example, show that these assumptions do not hold. It's not as insignificant, it's quite sizable. So we should have expected that there might be a sizable opposition against publicly imposed measures. And second, it's not the radical extremes, neither on the left nor on the right, but these people perceive themselves as part of the political middle ground, and but most importantly, not represented by any of the established parties in Parliament. Neither the moderate right nor the moderate left, neither the extreme left nor the extreme right. At first sight, it seems as if there is a political potential which has largely been ignored by the political establishment, and the defining feature of this political potential is distrust in political elites, in the political system, in the media, in parties, and in particular in government. And so this brings me back to Brandon's earlier point on trust. I think it's for people who don't trust government, and for people who don't trust science. A publicly imposed vaccination of a scientifically completely new vaccine must be something horrifying. This is apparent from the very beginning, from the empirical evidence. So for good reasons, the German government very early on, major parties very early on decided not to pursue the strategy of mandatory vaccination. This was very, even at a point when it was unclear whether a vaccine would be available at all. The government immediately declared that they will rely on a strategy of voluntary vaccination. That they will be definitely. There will be definitely no mandatory vaccination. This is the debate we meanwhile have in Germany. So there has been a change in policy in fall as a consequence of the change in government. We will see how this will turn out. On the basis of our results, you may expect an intensification of political radicalization, because it's frustrating those who haven't trusted you from the very beginning.
So I would like, you were talking about the effect of constraint. François Salvadori talked to me about a study published in Lancet Public Health from January 7th on the effect of mandatory COVID-19 certificates on vaccine uptake in 6 countries, and it shows spectacular results for France, a 13-point boost, so to speak, after this what we call here 3G constraint was imposed. In the weeks preceding the realization of the measure and ongoing for several weeks after, a concrete and spectacular increase in people getting their shots. In comparison with other European countries, this study suggests that the effect was stronger where the population had been more skeptical. It helped them, it gave them the nudge or whatever little push that they might have needed. And it shows, we were discussing about how the French government has shifted strategies during especially in terms of the vaccination campaign, by starting very reluctantly, by perhaps overestimating the weight and the influence of the anti-vaccine movements, and was very, very prudent, very, very hesitant, and also failed to really enable everybody to get their shots. The infrastructure, the logistics wasn't really ready. Now, at some point, they decided that a majority had been achieved probably, and decided to be more constraining, and it seems to have worked. But this shift and there has been a lot of not clear communication from the government. I could also mention the case of Professor Raoult in Marseille, who very early on in the pandemic has promoted a drug that he had developed, hydrochloroquine, I think it's called, and said it was magic and it was going to cure everybody against COVID. This person received a lot of attention. In fact, at some point last summer, I think, or summer 20, President Macron went and visited him in Marseille with cameras running. This has had a very strong effect of giving him more credibility, and has done a lot of harm in the strategy that the government was trying to implement of building on a scientific board and taking reasonable decisions, so to speak. And this is one thing, one point on which Professor Salvadori and I spoke a lot on the phone. These hesitancies in the message of the government, like this, giving too much attention to Professor Raoult, or the First Lady, Madame Macron, received doctors who were openly critical of the vaccine at the Élysée. This has a very strong effect against their own way of what they are saying. And it suggests, it's one of the examples that shows that the political speech has had very many difficulties coming up to scientific speech, or has not been able to explain or not been able to support the the fact that these are different timings. It takes, for instance, it took only 1 year to develop the vaccine, if you want to look at it, but it took 30 years after first scientists had discovered or had the idea that mRNA was maybe promising as a source of vaccines. And before that, it had taken 30 years since the DNA had been discovered, and it took hundreds of years actually to get there. It's when you talk about scientific development, it takes long. Things are not known. Scientists have had to react extremely fast. Didn't have the information, couldn't make definitive claims or have definitive facts, and the politique, the government, at least the French government, has been very criticized, or can be probably criticized, for not giving room to that and not being able to explain that it takes time, that things can change, that you should adapt. It's not the only government that can be criticized for doing things like that. And of course, I look to the US, where we are the epitome of the non-scientific speech. And so this is, I think one thing, this is, I wish I could have given a good practice, and actually I could, in France, we actually looked up to the way Germany did it, with a chancellor who was a scientist, who showed compassion, who did not take the citizens or didn't treat them like little children, and was able to explain that things were more complicated, more complex than they might wish they were.
I would like to add that I think Merkel should have talked more than our Minister of Health. It really would have helped a lot if Merkel, in a way that who can address us as mature human beings, and who was able to appeal to us that this is the sensible thing to do, even if you have doubts about the vaccine. It is a sign of civil solidarity to do this now. This is our way out. It's the obvious answer. And not many other people were able to appeal, I think, to the population like that. But she could have, it was the end of her chancellorship, of course, but she should have been the one to send the message. That's my opinion.
This is what I would like to just add one thing on this. Elections is not a good time for a quiet and constructed communication. So I think the German election played a role in Merkel becoming less visible, perhaps, and it is also playing a role in decisions that are being taken in France right now, I would say. So unfortunately, a political time is not the same as scientific time, and it's really hard to admit, but it needs to be told and told and told.
Well, but as a political scientist, I may add that Michael's communication behavior, I wouldn't say it was a strategy. Her communication behavior was consistent in all the crises. She communicated poorly in 2015 in the Eurozone crisis, 2012, 2013, when we had a new president who criticized this and claimed that the chancellor should explain more to the voters or more to the citizens what she's going to do and what the decisions taken. So and it was the same in this pandemic. Even if she time and again relied on scientific experts and expertise, it does not mean that there is a consistent strategy. And that she was able to explain the policies she thinks necessary in a plausible and consistent way. Although it was mentioned in the beginning, Germany is a very different case because of its federal system. And the necessity to bring together 16 heads in government. But this allowed Merkel to pursue a policy style which she was familiar from the European summits, the previous European crisis. She did exactly in the Corona crisis. She did exactly what she did in this crisis. She tried to bring together the heads of government into negotiations and time-consuming, frustrating compromise, producing time-consuming, frustrating compromises, which nobody was willing to implement afterwards. This was not the way how you can build up trust and confidence in your decisions and in your actions. So it's remarkable the speed in which the German government lost confidence was highly remarkable. So there are several surveys around which clearly show this, that it's on the one hand the support, the popular support of these policies, and more generally the trust in government in this case. So I would expect even if the pandemic is over, the long-term consequences of the pandemic for the German political system can be quite severe and damaging. So this is, and I don't think that this has to do with elections. Of course, elections. This was bad timing, and it's the coincidence of elections and crises are not ideal in democratic political systems. This is why in political science there was a debate which type of political system would perform better in such a crisis: autocracies or democratic political systems. And among the democratic political systems, there was a debate which type of leadership would be preferable. Populists in government, as we had in the US and Brazil, or a responsible leadership, as in some European countries. The jury is still open, but the last German election campaign is not a good example for the power of public deliberation in election campaigns, because even if the citizens considered the pandemic to be the most important political problem, the political parties consistently tried to avoid debating this issue in the election campaign. They didn't address it in their election manifestos. It didn't play a role, and they didn't address it in the election campaign. The election campaign was about irrelevant issues. The book of Baerbock, the laughter of Laschet in a public event, and some other things. This was frustrating for a responsible democratic citizen. This was a frustrating waste of an opportunity. So for a democratic optimist who believes in the power of public deliberation and an exchange of argument and so on, I think there were many opportunities to convince citizens of your ideas and your plans and the necessities. It's in some way it resembles to previous election campaigns when the parties argued there will be no increase in taxation, and the result of coalition negotiations was an even higher increase in negotiations than discussed before. And this time there was no discussion of any mandatory measures. There was not even an idea of a new wave of a pandemic, and there was no debate of new mandatory measures. And as a result of coalition negotiations, there was the proposal of mandatory vaccinations. They came out of nothing, and this is not the best way of how to convince citizens of controversial issues.
Yeah, Florence, I think we can ask maybe one more wrapping up question before we go into the chat. I don't know what's important. I'll just start talking and you can add, Florence, if we want to make it a double question. But I mean, we've painted the pictures citing from your study as well of what the anti-vaccine movement was like a year and a half ago, roundabout, how many people, how diverse it was. It is, I think, under the German measures, it has in a way, I mean, it's everywhere, but it's small groups. It has dwindled. It has turned into these Spaziergänge, these walks. These groups, I don't know, have this peaceful illusion around them as if there's no polarization in the group. At the same time, these walks are, I don't know, in Freiburg around the university clinic area, which is enraging medical personnel. In other parts of the country, in the eastern part, people just peacefully walk around, activists for vaccination that feel maybe threatened by that as well. At the same time, my personal experience is that under the German measures, in my surrounding, people have come around and gotten vaccinated in December because it got so difficult. Life got pretty restricted for them. So where do you see the movement headed in the course of the year in your various countries? The movement, which isn't the movement. Sorry.
Who would you like to go first?
Let's go to the US first, and then we'll take it home.
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I'm hoping that we can bring the temperature down on this debate here. It's going to be a big test, though, of whether we can get vaccination levels high enough, especially given the heterogeneity people have highlighted, including at the state level where the policies may differ, that the US could be vulnerable to recurrent outbreaks. I mean, the world is probably going to be vulnerable to recurrent outbreaks, it appears, but we may be disproportionately more vulnerable if we're not able to separate this issue from the, the partisan politics that have infected it. So I am over the next year, what I'll be looking for is whether this issue continues to become an issue of partisan contestation, and we see state policy efforts moving forward that might roll back vaccine mandates or prevent employers from imposing their own vaccine mandates. That would be the bad scenario. The good scenario is that actually Donald Trump continues to say the vaccine is good. So he's actually in the position of being the responsible person on this issue. He's been the one saying the vaccine is good and boosters are good. Now, he hasn't supported mandates, but he's spoken more positively about it. So there's going to be a fight within the Republican Party about exactly how to play this issue. And that's going to be a key determining factor moving forward, because those folks have so much of a greater platform than the ones we talked about earlier, like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. They can make news nationally and at the state level and give people cues that they'll listen to. So, it's a bit out of our hands. But ultimately, I don't know how we really get this pandemic under control without mandates in some form. That's how vaccines have always succeeded. We have a long history in this country going back to George Washington inoculating his troops against smallpox in the 18th century. The hope is that we can return this issue to a consensus one, but I don't expect that to happen in the next year.
Do you have a prognosis from France, Florence, or for France?
Well, I would say that a lot of it depends on what's going to happen in the next few weeks, actually, with the presidential election going on. It has been almost impossible not to politicize, even though all parties are being very, very careful. Emmanuel Macron has I think on purpose, being very provocative when he said he wanted to ruin life of those who are not vaccinated, because I think he knows it's a minority and they're not going to vote for him anyway, so it doesn't risk much. It's just being clear. And I'm also curious, and that's opening up, but I really see a similarity to the fact that climate change is not being thematized in the political or in the election runs that I have seen in Germany as well. It's been very discreet. It's fallen far below any expectations that I would have had. And in France, it's also a very, very minor topic. And the big parties and the small parties and there's a multitude of candidates, they're all focusing on not so important issues, actually, the same issues as every time. So I would, I think they would. I think the French population would probably come around as far as being vaccinated is concerned. But I also do see some crystallization point, so to speak, on that issue. And I wouldn't really dare to make a prognostic on what's going to happen.
Yeah, Professor Grande.
On Germany, of course, the answer must remain open, as we are right in front of a new peak of the Omicron wave. So we should expect the peak of this wave in the first half of February. And yesterday, the heads of government decided not to change the existing rules, to introduce new mandates. The most likely consequence is an intensification of political conflict. On the one hand, among established parties, and here politics, in fact, does play a role. We have a new leadership of the Christian Democrats, and we will have a series of important state elections in North Rhine-Westphalia and most importantly in Bavaria. And in Bavaria, the head of government, Söder, will be struggling for political survival in the coming 2 years. And we've learned in 2018 what can happen if the CSU is struggling for survival, this can be. This is one aspect. On the other hand, what we've been observing is a radicalization of Corona protest. It's with an increasing importance of extreme right groupings, with an increasing violence even in smaller settings, and so on. In a worst case scenario, the decision on mandatory vaccination, and in particular the decisions on its implementation, will serve as fertile ground and an opportunity structure for political radicalization. This may intensify if what I would call the moralization of a political debate cannot be tempered. One of the characteristic features of German Corona politics in the last 2 years was something like politics of what is in political science called blame avoidance. Governments time and again fail to achieve their objectives, and if it's not your political opponent who can be blamed, or some foreign force, you need somebody else. And in the last months, it was citizens who were blamed. Those citizens who resisted to take a vaccine, because they are responsible for all the misperformances in the public health system, the increase in infection rates, even if figures don't hold. We meanwhile learned that even if you got 3 shots, it doesn't prevent you from becoming infected. So vaccination has not thus far delivered. It has not allowed to keep the curve flat, as we've observed in North German federal states, where we have the highest vaccination rates, but at the same time the highest infection rates. So it's this is a constellation which can, in a way, it's a political opportunity structure which can result in high levels of conflict, the development of Corona protests in the last months clearly showed that the development is more or less out of control. On the one hand, of political decision takers. On the other hand, within these movements, because the current restrictions on protest did not prevent people from marching on the streets. They do it in a different way. The walks on Mondays and so on. Problem is that these walks are hardly under control of police forces. I don't want to advocate full control in these cases. Point is, it's if we can expect an intensification of political conflict, and a weakening of controls, or who might allow for channeling political conflict in the political system. This is for political scientists. This is a difficult constellation, and I don't think that that the German. That Germany will be a case from which other countries can learn a lot in the coming months. So it hasn't been best practice in the past, and I don't think that there will be good practice in the coming months. But this doesn't sound very optimistic, I must admit. Okay.
At least our testing situation has been better than in the US if we're getting competitive now.
The point is, I think it's important to distinguish between, on the one hand, those who are unwilling to get a vaccine and those who don't have the opportunity to get it, because in some cases, it's the lack of public infrastructures, insufficient public infrastructures. It's the social inequality. Florence mentioned this in the French case. The social inequality plays out importantly when it comes to the density of family doctors in richer parts of, say, for example, in Bavaria. Because I didn't get my vaccine from public infrastructures, but from our family doctor. It's important. And this brings us back to this blame game. Who's to blame for this? Is it governments who didn't pay sufficient attention to the strengthening and the provision of public infrastructures, or is it the people who didn't get their vaccine? So I think such a situation calls for a change in perspective. Blaming anti-vaxxers was in some way the easiest and the cheapest way to get out of the hassle. I think the coming months will teach us that this will not work out.
I think that's what it boils down to, public infrastructure again and again. And I think that's a point that Brendan Nyhan kind of makes in his article on how the vaccine could succeed, that the local infrastructure is important, that people need to be integrated in some kind of local structure, maybe a church, if they have a good family doctor. I mean, we can talk about the newspapers dying, what's the source that you trust, all these things. I would like to open the chat. I promised that we would. So we'll take 2 questions from the chat, and I'm going to call on our friend Josefine. If you want to suggest 1 or 2 questions that you could read to our speakers.
I will probably have to rephrase them. So if I misunderstand something, please correct me. One question to Professor Nyhan is, you said that the Republican party or voters are both vaccinated people and unvaccinated people. And there's a question if being part of the anti-vaccination movement is becoming part of the Republican Party identity now, And would you say the Republicans are using this opportunity to reach more masses and maybe even change their target audience and divide even more?
You want to maybe read another question straight away?
And another question is, how do you view the Great Barrington Declaration? And a third question is, what would you say would be, if mistrust is something that's a keyword for many people who are not getting vaccinated or are not confident in the government anymore, what would be something the government can do to regain trust in different countries, or what make people regain trust in medical systems? Should I read some more questions?
Thank you.
No, that's great. I'm happy to speak to the first point. I'll say on the third, there's some interesting research from Michael Bang-Petersen at Aarhus University in Denmark on the importance of transparent communication, even when information is negative, as for promoting trust. I think our public health institutions in the United States haven't been especially good at that, and it creates a sense that something is being withheld, or that people are slanting their statements to try to achieve some desired outcome. And that won't magically fix the low trust that's characteristic of the United States, but it's something. There are no quick fixes to these kinds of trust. I think it's more effective generally to try to find those folks who are already trusted and enlist them as messengers on behalf of vaccines and try to fix the social trust problem, which is not something that is fixable in a simple way. But anyways, that might be one strategy that we could consider. In terms of the first point, because I know we have to wrap up, folks have been with us a long time. What I would say for what the choice Republicans are facing right now is that on the one hand, most Republicans are vaccinated, but on the other hand, the intensity of the issue, right? The people who have the most passionate and vocal views, the people who might mobilize against you in a primary, the intensity is all on the anti-vaccine side, right? And politicians are responsive not just to the balance of public support, but its intensity, right? So one reason that gun control has been so difficult in the United States, even on measures that poll very high, is because the intensity is so asymmetric that folks who support gun rights here do so with a passion that frightens folks. People are worried about crossing them politically. I think the same is true here. And then finally, the mandates is a way of talking about the issue that unites the pro and anti-vaccine sides of the right. They're both opposed to mandates right now on COVID vaccines, right? And so you can talk about this issue in a way that anti-vaccine movements here is favorable without actually questioning the vaccines themselves. And that's been one of the ways people try to straddle the issue. Yeah, it's going to be a real challenge.
Anything to add? I think we also had a very last question, which is important, that I'm very busy with in my head as well. We did not discuss how radical these movements can grow. Can they become dangerous? In our pre-talk, I mentioned that here in the office, we've talked about the new publication in the US by Barbara Walter, How Civil Wars Start, and that the US is fulfilling a couple of preliminaries for a civil war to start in her study. How do you see, I think that is an important question maybe to still discuss. How do you see the potential of the radicalization of the movement, or do you see it then melting into something else, into another political effort?
I think this is a very important question for the moment. For the moment, once again, I started with the two other contributors may then add the optimistic version. For the moment, I think that there is a threat of increasing radicalization, and what we observe is an increasing violence in these protests. If we look at studies on the likelihood of violence and of violent radicalization, there are several factors that may contribute. Of course, the response of public authorities, of police forces, and so on is one of them. And I think we need to be. This is not to say that there is an automatical mechanism at work. It's well possible to politically influence these processes, even if we are at a later stage of developments, which gone out of control. It seems, at least it seems as if it's out of control. But for the moment, there's some evidence that this development, that these protest movements would lead to an intensification of conflict, even violent conflict. This must not say that as some speculated, there will be a new corona terrorism, but if you take some of the factors, if it's a matter of life and death, for example, an either or, and so on. If there are no possibilities to temper such conflict or to channel it into the political system, if there is no political party who takes up the issue, and so on, then it's we should take the danger seriously. Well, Freiburg maybe is an exception. In Munich and other places, or in some parts of Saxony, even in smaller cities in Saxony, there has been violence against police forces, and there have been clear statements by authorities responsible for these events that this violence is quite unusual to them. The point is that, and here another factor comes into play. We must not forget that the radical participants in these protest events are only, in fact, one small part of these movements. That the significant majority is politically moderate. And one of the key issues is whether this moderate center ground become radicalized. Thus far, and probably Freiburg is too far away from some other parts of Germany. Thus far, it was a radical. The movement has been characterized by participation from extreme right groupings who can, to some extent, be held responsible for violence. In other countries, in Austria, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, last weekend, in Italy, we observe violent outbreaks in these movements under the condition that other movements join these campaigns, and in particular those movements which are known for violent force. Football hooligans are an example. It's as soon as they experience this protest as an opportunity to act in this way, and the extreme right is another example. Now the football supporters in Freiburg are not that violent. I know this, but it's these are outsiders who come in and transform the political character of such movement. This can take place. It must not. But you have to be sensitive to such possibilities, because the attitude, this can't happen here. Via Freiburg is a bit optimistic. I would like to leave the optimistic conclusion to the others.
I think we'll have to leave. Thank you, Professor Grande. I think we'll have to just leave a goodbye to Brendan Nyhan, who's in the middle of a normal teaching day over there in New Hampshire, and we just want to thank you for your time over there, and thank you, Professor Grande, and thank you, Florence, also for taking on the double role. And it takes dedication to do this international, intercultural conversation and an effort to compare notes and then get to a basis. It takes a bit of time. I thought it was quite insightful, and we'll try and continue the conversation. I think the idea now is that we all improve our French, and we can do this in French in a couple of weeks, just to be polite about it. Yeah, thank you to the audience for your question in the lively chat. We'll put the discussion up on YouTube tomorrow. Tomorrow we at the Carl-Schurz-Haus are also hosting another event with Doris Simon, Deutschland correspondent in Washington, D.C. if she's not called for an emergency press conference because of Ukraine. So it's a little up in the air, but otherwise you can listen to her and her ideas about how the Senate and Joe Biden are doing right now, and what's to be expected of the midterm elections. So thank you to the Centre Culturel in Florence. Let's do this again and compare notes. And thank you, Professor Grande, to you in Berlin. Bye, have a good evening.
Good evening.